NADF welcomes you to the Prosperity Podcast, where inspiration meets innovation. I'm your host, Brian Davey, and we're delving into the heartbeat of economic prosperity in Northern Ontario. Join us as we bring you dynamic guests, sharing ideas, stories, and news that fuel the growth of Indigenous businesses. From success stories to cutting-edge strategies, we're your go-to source for cultivating prosperity in the heart of the North. Get ready to unlock the potential of Indigenous entrepreneurship. This is the Prosperity Podcast, because when we grow together, we all prosper. Let's get started. Today we're going to be talking with Wendy Roberts. She's our bookkeeper with NADF here at the Thunder Bay office. Good day, Wendy. How are you?
I'm good, Brian.
Good
Happy
for
to be
you.
here.
Happy? Well, yeah, for sure. So, to begin, let's tell the audience a little bit about who you are. Where did you go to get here, and how long you been here?
Well, I've been at NADF for a little over a year. Prior to that, I worked in public accounting. I worked for the same accountant for 12 years. He was my mentor, taught me everything I know. For schooling, I went to Confederation College and got my accounting diploma. And when I was done that, I figured I wanted to do the university degree. So I got my HBA in business from Laurentian University with a double minor in religion and women's studies. And then I decided to complete my CPA designation, and I'm in my last year of the CPA designation.
Awesome. Tell us a bit about NADF and the area that you cover and the role that you play at NADF.
So for NADF, I cover all of northwestern Ontario from Timmins to the Winnipeg border, Manitoba border.
Right.
My role at NADF is to facilitate training and development for Indigenous entrepreneurs so that they can do their own books and establish financial statements, so they kind of understand what they're doing when they're in their business. A lot of times they start a business and they don't realize how important the bookkeeping function is, or they don't know how to do it. And my job is to facilitate that training and teach them the things that they might not know or ways to make it more efficient.
Okay. So these are Indigenous entrepreneurs that are on and off reserve, or just off reserve, or on reserve, or?
They're for on and off reserve. Even the e-commerce sites, e-commerce is really starting to take off now. So a service-based business, product-based business, as long as they're an Indigenous entrepreneur in our service area, I can help them.
Okay, so when you say Northern Ontario, you're not referring to Sault Ste. Marie, North Bay, or Sudbury, or?
That is another area that would go to another institution. If they ever call and they ask for questions, we can always direct them to whatever organization deals with that area there. I do know there's a little bit of overlap sometimes when you start getting close to the area divisions, but we're usually pretty good at assisting them in finding what organization they can contact in their area.
Okay. Now tell me, how important is bookkeeping to a small business?
Bookkeeping doesn't get enough credit.
All right.
Bookkeeping is very important to a small business.
What is it, first of all? What is bookkeeping?
Bookkeeping is keeping track of all your expenses and all your revenues that your company makes. Mm-hmm. Whether it be a small expense such as buying coffee for the office, or a large expense like buying a computer or a piece of machinery that's going to make your job easier. A lot of businesses don't realize the time and effort that it takes to put into the bookkeeping, or they really don't understand the purpose. They think if I have money in my bank account, I'm making money, not realizing that it's not exactly that cut and dry. There's a lot more steps to it than that. There's expenses and things like that some people just don't take into account. They just look at the bank statement and say, oh, yeah, I've got money, not realizing that they really aren't making money because of all the other expenses they haven't accounted for.
So bookkeeping is something that a sole entrepreneur can do on his or her own initially, or is this something you have to hire right off the get-go when you start your business?
You can absolutely do it yourself to start.
Okay.
In fact, sometimes it's easier to do that, especially if you're small. If you're hiring an external bookkeeper, hiring an internal bookkeeper even, it tends to get quite costly. If you have an idea of where you're going to keep the receipts and what you're going to do with everything, you can pretty much start on yourself. And there's places like NADF that will show you from the beginning, when you come in with a shoebox and say, have receipts, where we can put it and where it will go. And then they can make the decision. Do they want to keep doing it themselves, or is this something that they just don't enjoy and they do want to set somebody else to do it?
Talking about receipts, when they're accumulating expenses in their business, can you just scan the receipt and keep that as a record instead of the hard copy, or do you have to keep hard copies in a shoebox somewhere?
Well, that's a gray area. It depends on who you ask. The CRA likes to see physical copies, so if you're dealing with the Canada Revenue Agency, the digital copy isn't always acceptable. Sometimes they will, sometimes they won't. Sometimes it's easier to reference a paper copy. Some people just don't enjoy it, and they do digitize all their records. It is personal choice. I personally love paper, so I keep receipts for everything. And I just find that when you file it month by month, sometimes it's easier to find compared to when you go to a computer and you try and pull up a month and say, okay, this receipt was in January. It then goes into how you named it, where you put it, where you saved it. So when you're starting out, sometimes the best way to do it is keep that paper receipt. As you get more experienced and more advanced, maybe you do want to put everything online or digital.
Okay, so when you want to keep track of your credits and your debits and all the information that's coming into your business that is related to bookkeeping, is it best to just write it down on a piece of paper, or should we become more familiar with Excel spreadsheet, or is there something else that we could use, Microsoft Word, or maybe you can just touch on that a little bit?
Well, Microsoft Word isn't ideal just because of the columns and the spacing. I think that would be more of a headache for a small business owner to try and set everything up in terms of the spacing and the organization of it. Some people are comfortable, they're not computer or tech savvy, they prefer to write everything down. That's why there are manual ledgers. A lot of the clients that come in, we start them off on manual ledgers if they can get in the habit of writing everything down, what they've purchased, what they've sold, what they've produced. It's a good habit that they get into once they've kind of progressed to that. If they want to go into Excel, Excel is a very easy program to use. There's lots of videos online how to use Excel. We can offer training here at NADF on Excel. There are other organizations that offer training on Excel. It's very, very easy to use, and it is easy to integrate into other programs as you start building capacity and you start getting larger. So manual ledgers are fine. If you want to start in Excel, absolutely go from there. And if you feel confident, there's always accounting programs that you could look at. I never really recommend that for someone that's just starting out, because sometimes that can be overwhelming with all of the different components and the different categories that can be in the program. And setting it up tends to overwhelm a lot of people, and they just want to walk away from it. Once it's set up, however, it tends to get easier to use. Okay.
So let's sticking with the sole entrepreneurship scenario, and let's say tax time is about to, you got to do your taxes for the government, one of the greater evils, but it needs to be done. What do they need to bring to their tax accountant as a business for them to do your tax return?
Well, it depends on their proficiency or if they have an internal or external bookkeeper. A lot of times an accountant will, unless it's an audited financial statement, and if it's a sole entrepreneur, it's usually not. It would just be like a copy of the financial statements, balance sheet, income statement, trial balance, and some of the receipts and bank statements to prove that the expenses that you are claiming are legitimate. Some of them prefer having it emailed to them. Some of them will still take a box full of receipts and organize it. It does save on a sole proprietor's bill, though, if they have it organized and they say this was all January's receipts, this was for expenses for this machine, or this was for gas. Because don't forget, an accountant or a bookkeeper is going to charge you for the time they spend working on your files. So the more organized you are, the less it's going to cost you, especially if you do have a CRA debt that you have to pay.
Is it safe to say that most expenses you incur in your business can be used for tax deductions?
It depends on the nature of the business, and it depends on what the expenses are. If you have a home office, there's a portion of home office expenses that can be prorated and can be used for your tax purposes. If you're entertaining guests, you don't get to write off a whole amount of that. Some people are under the misguided conception that if they go and they have a big dinner and they take all their contacts out, that they can write that off as a business expense. It doesn't work that way. Unfortunately, for a few of them, they get surprises when it comes to the accountant saying, well, you don't get to use that whole deduction. So for the most part, if it's a legitimate business expense and you can prove that it was a value to the business, then you're usually okay to deduct it.
Yeah. Okay, sticking with the small entrepreneur again, you have, let's say, 3 employees, and you're the You're the manager or the boss, the owner of the company. How do you pay yourself? Do you call it a salary? Do you call it a draw? Do you pay yourself every 2 weeks, every month, or whenever the money's there, you take it?
Well, that would be entirely different. If you're a sole proprietor and you don't have an incorporated company,
Yeah.
any of the money that you make in the business once the expenses are paid is yours.
Okay.
On the tax return, it isn't separate. It's a separate form that's filled out there. So your income is actually the income earned after all your expenses are paid. There wouldn't be a benefit to pay yourself a salary because when you file your taxes, you would file a 2125, which is the form on the tax return. That would already calculate what your income is, and then it would calculate whatever deductions it needed to take off for your CPP and EI contributions that you would have normally paid if you worked for somebody else. So anything that you make bottom dollar, unless you're a partnership, is yours. If you're a partnership, obviously whatever you make is split down the middle, or whatever your partnership agreement dictates.
Okay. So when it comes to writing up financial statements, there's a variety or different types of financial statements that can be produced or generated either through you personally if you're able to do that, or you're using your bookkeeper that has the qualifications or the ability to produce financial statements, or your accountant. I suppose that would be an expensive way to go, but what are the different types of financial statements are there? Like, I know the Cadillac is the audit, right? And there's a whole bunch of other levels, not a bunch, but there's two levels below that or 3 levels below that. Maybe you can just describe each of those.
So they're constantly changing the terminology for financial statements. The balance sheet used to be called the balance sheet. Now it's the statement of financial position. The income statement is now the statement of profit or loss. For a sole proprietor, that's usually what you're going to use, because if you were going to go for any sort of funding, you would have your T1 tax return and you would provide that because that would have the information in it. When you start getting into corporate, that's where you get to the notice to reader, review engagement, audits. Financial statements can be made for whatever you need them for. The bigger you are, the more in-depth they are. The common, like I said, is the notice to reader, especially for corporations. That's normally what they ask for when you're going for any sort of funding.
Yeah, you're talking, when you say funding, are you talking about bank funding, bank financing?
Bank financing, even NADF, or for our loans and grants, we do ask if they have a corporation. We ask for financial statements. We want to see the historical financial data for those businesses. If they're a sole proprietor, we do want to see some tax information to see that they are making money. So yes, absolutely.
Is there a general rule of thumb when to hire a bookkeeper, and how much would you pay that bookkeeper?
There isn't a general rule of thumb. It's more so when you feel that A, you don't have the time to do it, or B, you just don't want to do it. If you don't want to do it and you keep putting it off and procrastinating, either you're going to have a big bill at the year end when you have somebody actually go in and try and do everything prior to tax season, or you're going to end up not knowing what you're making or what you believe you're making. You might be thinking you're making a profit, but every month you're losing money based on your expenses. So, it's prudent to hire a bookkeeper when you feel like you don't have control of that part of your business anymore, or like I said, you're just not interested in doing it. There's no point when you're trying to run a business doing something that you dislike when there are qualified people out there that can do it for you. In terms of salary, anywhere from $33,000 if it was a full-time employee to $50,000 for a bookkeeper, depending on qualifications. And then when you start getting into the ones that have, the degrees and stuff like that, it can go anywhere from $50,000 to $100,000. Also depends on the size and the scale of the corporation and what they're willing to pay. So it depends on the responsibilities as well. Some are just bookkeepers for accounts payable, some are just bookkeepers for accounts receivable. There are some that do everything from the beginning all the way up to the trial balance, and there are some that go all the way through and file the T2 and T1 tax returns.
Is there a role that the bookkeeper plays when it comes to putting together a business plan, particularly as it relates to the pro forma statements, the projections and so forth?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Your bookkeeper is going to have better idea, I feel, because they see your expenses, especially if they've been with you for a long period of time. They see your expenses, they see the ins and outs, they know what's reasonable. A cash flow projection is what you believe you're going to make. The bookkeeper can pull that information up and give you, the percentages of, this, if we increase sales by this much, the projection would be this much. They would have that information. They would understand what expenses increase because they're the ones that see it every month. Somebody that's running the business might not realize that, they're paying for hydro or gas and it's went up 10%, but the bookkeeper would. So there's a really valuable role because they kind of understand the financial workings of the business. It's, like I said, especially if they've been with you for a long period of time.
So if you're hiring a bookkeeper, that would be an awesome question, I guess, to ask is what's your experience in putting together these projections in terms of balance sheets and cash flow and income and operating and so forth? Would that be a very important question to ask?
That would be a question that you would want to know. You'd want to know that they understand what the statements are. They might not understand all the terminology because, like I said, the terminology changes quite frequently. But I mean, if they know what a balance sheet is, I don't think it really matters what jargon they're using, if they're using balance sheet or they're using statement of financial position, those kind of things like that. But I mean, if they know how to do it and they know the basics, the categories and the information in the statements don't change. It's just been the name. So I think that's very, very important for them to understand.
Awesome. Okay. So what are some of the most common bookkeeping mistakes that small business owners make, and how can they avoid them?
So I think one of the biggest mistakes that I've seen people make is they're afraid to ask when they don't know the answer. They either just kind of bury their head in the sand and pretend that the problem doesn't exist and they don't, or they just don't enter the information. And I think it's more so this fear of not, they're a business owner and they want to project that they understand and they know everything, and it's okay not to. And I think that's one of the biggest mistakes. And also the putting it off and the procrastinating to take care of the bookkeeping till later. From day one, you should have something in place for bookkeeping because you really want to know what your profit is, what your expenses are, because you want to know at the end of the day, am I making a profit or am I putting money into a losing cost? And if I am putting money into a losing cost, what can I change it? Sometimes that trajectory can change because you've caught it early enough. If you run it for a year and you've kept making the same mistakes over and over and over again, the chances of correcting those things are a little more difficult.
Yeah. The business is very important to the entrepreneur. Obviously, it's their life's blood, and they want to do very well at what they do, and they want to trust everybody in their business, particularly the bookkeeper, if that's the person that they hired for their business. How important is trust when it comes to hiring a bookkeeper and making sure that whatever you're asking him or her to do, that it's done ethically, legally, and in accordance with whatever ethics that are out there?
Well, it depends on, some people ask for if they're bondable. That's something that's been asked, if they can do a criminal reference check. If you're dealing with a CPA or an accountant, there is ethics and there's standards that have to be adhered to because of the rules of the CPA Canada and CPA Ontario. The people that you have looking after your finances and your money, you should be able to trust explicitly. You shouldn't worry that something's going to go wrong. They're there to take care of those things for you. And if you have any doubt, I always say trust your gut. You're going to get a read on somebody, and you're going to get that feeling that if you think that this person isn't trustworthy. And sometimes references. Bookkeepers tend to have multiple clients unless they're in-house. There's going to be references for that person and their capabilities and their trustworthiness and their ethics. We live in a world where we hope it's a perfect world and everybody acts ethically. Unfortunately, they don't. But there are departments in the police services that are focused just on fraud and things like that. So there are things in place, but I really say trust your gut when it comes to that. Most people can read people well and say, this person isn't going to work. And if you really don't, ask them for that reference check. Ask them for that criminal reference check. If they're a CPA, make sure they're in good standing. There's a website for, CPAs that say, whether they're suspended or, deregistered. So those are questions that you could be asking. Mm-hmm. And also, if there's in conflicts of interest, you really don't want a bookkeeper that's working for your competitor as well.
Yeah. Which brings me to the next question about outsourcing to companies that do bookkeeping that may be doing bookkeeping for other companies similar to yours. What are the pros and cons of going in-house with a bookkeeper versus outsourcing, or is that done, outsourcing to companies to do your bookkeeping for you?
So the pro of having an in-house bookkeeper is they have the pulse of the business. They are there all the time. They know the ins and outs of everything that is going on because they're there. The con of that is sometimes it's an unnecessary expense if your business doesn't have the scale to keep them there. But you've got them hired and now they're sitting there with nothing to do. Sometimes it doesn't hurt to cross-train somebody in that information as well. When you're dealing with like outsourcing, like to one of the big four, for example, accounting firms in Canada, the good thing with that is they deal with a lot of businesses in the same field. So there's the expertise there where they understand some of the expenses. Some of the expenses that are for mining and development or shred credits are entirely different than something that a restaurant would have. But they have that experience. They understand the ins and outs of the industries because they've worked on it in other businesses as well. The downside of outsourcing is if they get really busy, sometimes your work is not a priority because they're trying to get everybody's done at once, especially when there's quarterly reports for regulatory filings. Tax season, they tend to be very, very wrapped up at tax season. And the cost for outsourcing tends to be quite substantial.
So let's move on to software and see, with your experience working in this field for several years, obviously an entrepreneur will come to that question as whether or not they should use a software to run their business as opposed to relying on an Excel spreadsheet and doing themselves, or a bookkeeper may be using the software, or do bookkeepers use software, or they just stick to Excel spreadsheets?
No, they absolutely use software.
Okay. Maybe you can talk a little bit about software and what's valuable and what's not valuable.
So the good thing in the last couple of years with the trends is software tends to be compatible with a lot of other programs, which is wonderful as we kind of progress to this more cloud-based and AI-based society. It's nice to see that you can integrate those things back and forth between one another. For example, Excel will integrate with some of Sage functions, QuickBooks, etc. So that's nice to see. Software is something where I think the problem that we run into with a lot of small businesses is they go and they buy a software package and they don't understand what all of the different components of the package are or what they do. So they end up paying for a lot of things they don't need. Some of them don't understand the inventory management part of it because a lot of them do come with an inventory management. And they tend to go for the biggest package for some reason, and I'm not sure why. It just seems to be the biggest across the board. The bigger the better, I guess, or the payroll functions. So they pay for this software and they're underutilizing it. A lot of them, thankfully, have starter programs now where if you went to QuickBooks or you went to Starter, Sage or Xero, where it starts out with a small plan and then, okay, well, you've mastered that, you've got more to add to it, let's add to it. So that's kind of nice to see. And it's also nice to see that, a lot of them now have the option to scan your receipts for you. It takes a while to set up, but they can actually input the information from the receipt to save you that headache. Depending on the program, some of them do have their little glitches and flaws, but it's kind of interesting to see where software is going. And I do think the software is going to make things easier for entrepreneurs and for large corporations as things go ahead, especially with AI changing things continually and being able to learn. And maybe you have 50 Canadian Tire receipts. The software can start to figure out, okay, the Canadian Tire receipts now go to this person's purchases for the month. So software is really, really good in that aspect, and it's nice to see that a lot of businesses will be able to utilize it in the future as we kind of progress to that kind of, like I said, AI, digital, cloud-based society.
What is AI, digital, cloud-based? What the words you just used?
So AI is things like ChatGPT. AI is when you tell it something and you ask it something, and it will learn those things and it will remember them. And as you do things to the computer more and more, it learns it and it understands it, so it gets faster.
Does it do ratios? Can it do pro forma financials?
So here's the thing that I have noticed with quite a few of the programs so far. They've gotten better, but they're not good at math yet. However, I do see in the next couple of years, in the next couple of years, I do see the math improving. I ran some ratios through it one time, just to see what it would do, and they are starting to learn that part of it. When it first came out over a year ago, we were playing with some of the ratios here in the office actually, and the numbers were not correct at all. Digital is when you just scan the items in and it saves a copy on your computer. Like Dex is something where you can scan your receipts in and it will start a folder, save them in the folder, or it'll integrate. I believe that one integrates into Xero. So Sage software also now has that ability where you can scan your receipts, and once you put in the vendor and you say what the vendor is for, it will automatically put that receipt and those totals into those categories. So it saves you some time. Now, there's going to be flaws and there's going to be errors. It's going to require someone to check them. But for somebody that is hesitant to basically farm out their books or, wants to save time and money, this might be a way to go in the future.
Yeah. Is there some danger in putting it out in the cloud like that using AI? Do you lose privacy on some of those?
Well, that could be tricky. I believe that there is. They always say that these sites are secure and things like that. There's a lot of cloud-based security, especially for places like Sage or QuickBooks that do operate in the cloud-based environment where there is no, physical program in front of you. Everything goes up to the cloud. I do believe that the opportunity is there for things to happen. Look at bank breaches, same sort of thing. But on the flip side, I think that they're starting to realize how much is going to cloud-based, and they're finding always new ways to, prevent hacking and prevent those errors from happening. I don't think we're going to live in a society where it can never happen, but I definitely think that they're getting better at protecting our data and our privacy.
Will it ever come to a point where we no longer need bookkeepers, where everything is just digitized with this smart, intelligent software and all this cloud stuff? And
well, that's an argument for any field when you think about it. So you go back and forth. I don't think there's ever going to be a time when you are going to want everything to be 100%, no human interaction, no human contact. Machines can only learn so much. It doesn't have that emotional type of response to things. So sometimes when you're in a business, you need that emotional response. You need somebody to sit down and say, this doesn't look good, this looks great. You're not going to get that from a computer. And for reports, it can tell you a report and it can tell you what the numbers are, but there might be a reason behind those numbers or a meaning that they just won't pick up. And I think when it comes to taxes and that, there's always so many changes and rules. You can only teach a computer so much. There are things that will maybe not update that fast, that quickly. It took them several months before the enhanced CPP contribution was put into some of these programs. So I think that bookkeepers and accountants are pretty safe.
They're going to be around for a long time.
Yeah. We have a purpose.
So what is the, so let's say I have an established corporation that's doing really well. It's making up to like 10 million in revenue. And is there a different type of bookkeeper that I should be hiring when it comes to a smaller business that's under $1 million in revenue versus a corporation that's making over 10 million?
That's when you start looking at definitely having a CFO. You definitely want a chief financial officer.
Interesting. So when is that fine line then from bookkeeper to CFO?
Well, it's more so in terms of your obligations to your shareholders, because when you're incorporated, you have shareholders.
Right.
A bookkeeper might not be able to reproduce those type of reports in depth that a CFO would, and there's also the compliance rules, and a lot of times in the share books, in the minute books, I've seen where it said the CFO must be responsible for this, and this, and so it's kind of what you've got written into your agreement and what you have to tell your shareholders. You would not want a bookkeeper for a $10 million company just because of the amount of information that they have to deal with. The CFO is going to have a team, hopefully, that works under them, whereas normally a bookkeeper wouldn't, and the CFO would be able to delegate those tasks to get everything done because the picture is much larger scale.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for joining us and sharing some information with our audience. And We certainly look forward to having you back again in 12 months to see where things are at. And if people wanted to get in touch with you, what is the phone number, the general phone number of the organization they can call?
807-623-5397.
All right.
They'll get reception, and reception can direct them to myself, to account managers, to any information about our loans, our funds, or how to access the services here. And I don't think a lot of the entrepreneurs in our catchment area realize that NADF does offer the bookkeeping training and services for free.
Okay.
So there is no cost to them if they have questions or they need that additional assistance. That's what the purpose of the program is. So.
And the
we're here to help.
website is?
It's NADF.org. I believe you should know this, Brian.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Brian.
For joining us and sharing with us, for sure.
Absolutely.
Bewitch. That wraps up another episode of Prosperity Podcast, proudly brought to you by NADF. I'm your host, Brian Davey, and I've just delved into the heartbeat of economic empowerment in Northern Ontario. If you enjoyed today's episode and want to stay connected, be sure to subscribe, leave a comment. Your support fuels momentum of Indigenous entrepreneurship. Remember, on the Prosperity Podcast, we believe that when we grow together, we all prosper. So let's continue this journey of growth and success. Until next time, I'm Brian Davey signing off. Stay inspired, stay innovative, and let's keep prospering together.